Hey folks, and welcome to iWizard. So today I have a special one for you. I'm going to be talking about how Orwell's 1984 predicted the dangers that we currently face in our world and really envisioned with remarkable clarity our coming dystopian future. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. Jordan here. So I want to jump right in, but first I just want to remind you that Orwell's 1984 was published way back in 1949. So I do want you to think about that when we're talking about this book and how prescient his vision turned out to be. And this is basically Orwell's sharp critique, his quasi-satirical exploration of the worst and most horrific excesses of totalitarianism in the 20th century. So mainly inspired by the Soviet Union, but also elements of Nazi Germany. And so it's set in Oceania, and this is a place where people have no control over their lives. There's misery and scarcity and repression. Language is carefully manipulated to shape citizens' thoughts and control their minds. Fear is used as a tool to keep people in line so that they conform to the prevailing political orthodoxy. The story follows Winston Smith, a member of INGSOC's outer party. INGSOC, by the way, is short for English Socialism, and Oceania's political structure is divided into three classes. You have the inner party, which is the all-powerful ruling class, the outer party, basically the educated pencil pushers, so the administrative state, I guess you could call them. And then lastly, you have the largest group, which is the proles. And this is like the vast underclass who make up like 80% of the population. So anyhow, Winston works for the Ministry of Truth. So his job is to rewrite and distort history and facts. The Ministry of Truth is basically Pravda, right? So it's a monopoly on what gets to be printed, and they make films and art and educational content. And Winston is in the records department, so his job is basically to change history so that it aligns with the party's interests at any given time. And so the story is about how Winston wakes up, he begins to question the orthodoxies of the party, he buys a diary, which is illegal for him to have, and he meets this girl, Julia, who is a kindred spirit and fellow traveler, and together they try to infiltrate this ostensibly secret underground resistance group called the Brotherhood. So the story's fairly standard fare for the genre, the dystopian hero's journey and all of that, but the prophetic power of this book is in the details, in the world building and the big ideas. And I want to go over a few of them because Orwell just hits the nail on the head, and I just find it to be almost unbelievable that this was published in 1949. So the first thing to mention is that 1984 at its core is about how in order to control people's thoughts, you have to first and foremost control the words they use. You have to control the language. And this is where the Newspeak dictionary comes in. Newspeak is essentially an invention that the party has come up with to limit the possible scope and range of human thought by eliminating more and more words, controlling citizens' minds by essentially changing and limiting their lexicon. For example, it's impossible to fight for freedom if the word freedom is eliminated or if its meaning is changed. There's a character in the book named Sim, and he explains the purpose of Newspeak. He says, quote, "Don't you see the whole aim of Newspeak is to control the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it. The revolution will be complete when the language is perfect." Or even just think of the names of the government agencies in Oceania. You have institutions like the Ministry of Truth, which peddles propaganda and tells lies. You have the Ministry of Love, which tortures people. You have the Ministry of Plenty, which maintains a state of perpetual poverty and scarcity and food shortage. And what's crazy is that at first, most people are tempted to scoff at Orwell's concoctions and say, oh, come on, that's too on the nose. They call it the Ministry of Love, and that's the place where they torture people. Couldn't he have been a little bit more subtle, at least? And the answer is no. He couldn't, because we have seen this sort of brazen up as down, right as left gaslighting throughout our history. Remember the Jacobins during the French Revolution and their Committee on Public Safety? It turns out that the sole purpose of the Committee on Public Safety was to unleash a reign of terror, rounding people up and using the guillotine to lop the heads off of tens of thousands of people in a single year, wreaking so much death and destruction that they had to devise a canal-like drainage system to collect all of the blood rushing from their victims' necks. Or even just, I don't know, how about the fact that North Korea, which is about the furthest it's possible to get from being a legitimate democracy, they call themselves the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Or, I don't know, look at the Congo, which is just a place with an insane level of corruption and violence, especially against women, and rape and female genital mutilation and just general political instability. These guys call themselves the Democratic Republic of Congo. Actually, there's a list on Wikipedia of basically communist dictatorships, current and past, that have Democratic Republic in their official name. And the list includes North Korea, Vietnam, East Germany, Ethiopia, Somalia, Yemen, Afghanistan. The list goes on. And so if you're reading Ingsok's slogan, war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength, and your first reaction is, no way, that's too obviously backwards. Nobody actually living in that society would swallow that kind of BS. And it's like, actually they would. And if they didn't, there would not be anything that they could do about it. You will, in a totalitarian dictatorship, you will swallow the orthodoxy and you will like it. But there is so much more that in this book that reflects the world we live in today. We have a legacy media complex in this country that claims to be the ultimate arbiter of truth and that gets caught lying constantly on a regular basis on a whole range of issues. And sometimes we don't find out until years later. Not to mention, and this is something that few people even know about, you have a practice that outlets, definitely on both sides of the aisle, regularly engage in called stealth editing, which is when a media outlet or newspaper changes what they've previously written quietly and without telling anyone and with no record of that change being preserved. It's something our media outlets have always done, but now that everything is online, it's gotten even easier for them to do this on the regular. It's also never been easier, thankfully, to catch them doing it, because all you have to have now is a screenshot of the original article to compare it to. But it's amazing how often this is done. But if you want to know why outlets would do something like this, it's pretty easy to explain. So I can give you an example. Let's say, and this is entirely hypothetical, please don't try to link this to anything that's currently happening, but let's say that you have a political candidate in 2020 who's running for their party's nomination. And really, nobody likes this person. They're not popular. They're clearly not going to be the party's nominee. No chance in hell, right? So the media might then write a negative piece about that person, exposing all their flaws and everything bad they've done, just to kind of finally put the last nail in their candidacy and end their chances. But let's say that things sort of randomly change politically, and 4 years later, that same unpopular person who nobody liked at the time has surprisingly found her or himself in a position to actually run for president and win. So what the media might do is say, Well, shoot, 4 years ago, we called this person awkward and cringy and inexperienced. We attacked this person's record and we exposed their gaffes, and we promoted at the time another candidate. It would look really bad if we then turned around 4 years later and hypocritically wrote all these positive articles about this person. So that's where the stealth editing comes in. So what we'll do, they say, is we'll just go back and soften what we said earlier. We'll delete this one story we wrote. Maybe no one will notice. Maybe we'll go into another article and get rid of this unflattering anecdote we used. Or maybe we'll tinker with some of the adjectives and labels that we use to describe that person. We'll add some hedges here and there. Instead of really corrupt, we'll say possibly corrupt, and then we'll add according to some sources. And that way we can kind of quietly massage this person back into favor with the public and at the same time protect our own credibility in the process. You even see stealth editing with book publishers. This recently happened with Dr. Seuss. It happened a couple years back as well with Roald Dahl, where you have these publishers deciding to change all of Roald Dahl's books and basically get rid of any words that some Karen somewhere in 2024 finds offensive. And they quietly do this, and then predictably people find out and get really upset. And they get upset because these publishers are treating the adults who buy these books, usually parents, right? They're treating them like they can't think for themselves, like they can't be trusted to provide their children with the proper context to understand why this was written the way it was at the time. So anyways, this is done all the time, this stealth editing. And the reason I bring it up is that it's quite literally Winston's job in 1984. He says, quote, "Day by day, minute by minute, the past was brought up to date. All history was a palimpsest, scraped clean and reinscribed exactly as often as was necessary." So great quote there, but how scary is that, knowing that publishers actually in Orwellian fashion feel that it is their duty to bring the past up to date. What an Orwellian slogan. So again, Winston works in the records department at the Ministry of Truth, rewriting articles in exactly this same fashion. So if the party is at war with Eurasia and suddenly it decides to go to war with East Asia, what Winston and his colleagues have to then do is to go back and frantically rewrite all of the old articles and change every mention of Eurasia to East Asia so that it looks like the regime was always at war with East Asia. That way, you don't even have to announce it the next day. You can just replace one word for another. And if anyone gets confused and says, wait a minute, weren't we just at war with Eurasia? I thought we hated the Eurasian people. The regime can just say, "You must be confused, comrade. We have always been at war with East Asia. In fact, here, by the way, look, I have right here a newspaper from 6 months ago, and would you look at that? It says East Asia." And so the benefit of this is that you worked really hard as a regime to get your people to hate Eurasia so that you could manufacture consent for this forever war that you're in. And so it's risky to then turn around and say, "Oh, by the way, those people you blame for all your problems, we stopped fighting them yesterday, but there's a new group of people that we want you to hate, and it's East Asia." That is not going to work. People aren't going to buy that. And so you just demagogically channel and redirect the base passions and resentments of your people. And this way, you don't have to whip up those emotions from scratch. And by the way, all of this is very useful, is to give the people a common enemy, a scapegoat. That way, you redirect their attention away from what you're doing to them and focus them instead on some shadowy external enemy of the moment. And you see this in totalitarian states all over the globe, right? North Korea is constantly being aggressive with South Korea, not because they actually hope to win a war against South Korea or even want to be in a war against them, but because Kim Jong-un has to constantly show his population that the real bad guys live on the south side of the border. Same thing with China and Taiwan, or Russia and its bordering states, or Iran and Israel, whatever it is. And this is the purpose in 1984 of the 2 minutes hate. So 2 minutes hate is basically where everyone is called together once a day, wherever they are, wherever they work, to join in this public spectacle and stand in front of this giant television. And on the television is basically this montage of political propaganda. There's pictures of Goldstein bouncing around on the screen. By the way, Goldstein is like this fake scapegoat, enemy of the people type character. And there's like demonic war footage of whoever's the current geopolitical enemy. And people come together in their little blue Maoist worker uniforms, and they have to shout at the television and get all worked up. And they basically, this is how they let out all of their rage. And there's this atmosphere while this is all going on of fear and paranoia because everyone's watching one another. And so it becomes this like virtue signaling contest to see who is most angry at these politically expedient enemies of the state, and in contrast, who is most loyal to the regime of Ingsoc. And so a lot of this obviously has to do with simple fear too, lest we forget. It actually reminds me of Stalin would finish speaking, he'd be giving a speech, and there would be these standing ovations that would last for an hour sometimes, or even more, according to multiple sources, including Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago. And you might ask, why would an audience give an hour-long standing ovation to anyone, much less someone as odious as Stalin? And it's because Stalin would actually have his thugs kill the first person who sat down. Now, why would he do that? Well, apparently it wasn't that Stalin thought, oh, you're the first person who sat down and stopped clapping for me, and therefore that's definitive evidence that you must be an enemy of the state. No, the logic was that, yeah, there probably are no real enemies of my regime in the audience. But if there was one, wouldn't it be the first person who stopped clapping first? And so it becomes this contest that even Winston can't help but getting swept up in, joining in on the outrage. It's intoxicating, and it's virtually impossible for anyone to resist joining in, especially with all that pent-up rage that you have. Now, for the party, this works wonders because it obviously redirects citizens' subconscious feelings away from the party and toward external enemies, as I said, but it also sublimates their rage. It takes the lid off the pressure cooker, which in turn minimizes subversive behaviors and all of that. It's also a useful tool for manufacturing rage in the citizens when the regime wants to go to war. And I want to say this is precisely what our own Ministry of Truth does, by which I mean the government, mainstream media, social media algorithms, all of that. And what a great metaphor on Orwell's part. You know, something even in our world will happen and you turn on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, and what they do is they whip you into a frenzy of rage. There's no nuance. There's really only one side presented. You've got these anchors caked in makeup with fake voices and fake hair, and they're talking about some political issue, and they'll give you like a panel of 6 people, and basically they will have this fake conversation where each of the 6 quote-unquote experts fight with each other, basically to slip in their canned, pre-chewed, focus-grouped, regime-approved talking points. And the whole conversation lasts really no longer than 5 minutes, and you're sitting on your couch getting angrier and angrier, and that's our own version of the 2 minutes hate. Or you're on X or Facebook and your friends start sharing news stories and there's something big that happened and everyone you know is online. And so predictably, people start virtue signaling just like they do in 1984. You retweet this solemn statement that some celebrity or other posted. You put a flag in your image. You post the black square, right? You get together with others and you start patrolling everyone else's statements. And all of this is creepy as hell, right? But just to rewind a click and finish up with what I was saying, get back to 1984, my description of what the Ministry of Truth does. If you work at the ministry, once you've changed the records and the textbooks and the newspapers, then what you do is you throw the old articles down the memory hole. And this is another term Orwell invented. So if you hear people using that term, this is where it came from, which is basically when you just disappear something from reality. And again, this is stealth editing. This is search engines like Google, right? Let's say, I don't know, here's another made up example I'm going to give you. Totally made up. Let's say that you have a former president currently running to become president again, who was, I don't know, let's say shot at a campaign rally. And let's say that assassination attempt was handled really poorly by the Secret Service. And everyone agrees with that. And let's further say that the way this former presidential candidate handled being shot was kind of just objectively brave and inspiring to a lot of people. Say what you want about the guy, right? I'm personally not the biggest fan of politicians in general, and so I don't have a lot of nice things to say about any of them really. But let's say that there were heroic photos of that candidate getting up from being shot and pumping his fist in the air, and that this really gave this guy a bump to possibly defeat the other side's candidate, the candidate that nearly 90% of Google's employees support. Well, if you're Google, what do you do about that? You can't just be a neutral arbiter of the truth and let people think for themselves. Can you imagine that, letting people think for themselves? Well, it turns out that we don't have to imagine, because something like this just recently happened, and Google simply memory holed the incident from search results, and actually they continued to do so until they got hauled in front of Congress, at which point they had to admit that they had memory holed the incident, or at least they were trying to. But Google's been doing this for years, right? And they still do it. You'll Google something that is suddenly controversial, right? Imagine, if you will, a topic that was like a settled fact for nearly all of human history up until about 5 minutes ago. Something the vast majority of humanity, nearly all people in all societies that have ever existed, agreed upon. In fact, let's say it's an issue the vast majority of Americans by Pew and Gallup data agree on. And in fact, the vast majority of the world at large still agrees on today, even if they're afraid to speak up about it. I'd be more specific, but remember, I'm broadcasting on YouTube, which is owned by Google. So there you have it. Anyhow, so imagine that there's an issue we all used to agree on, and it's really been a hot button culture war issue for like 6 or 7 years at this point. And even still, it really is just a tiny minority of people who actually believe these new weird things about this issue. And you say, you know what, I'm just going to ignore the noise and I'm going to look it up on Google and do some research myself. But you'll be shocked to find that when you do, you're suddenly getting this new information. Suddenly, Google is telling you that human nature has changed. All the facts you thought you knew have been flipped on their head. And you're like, what the heck? Where's all this coming from? I don't know of any new discoveries that would have undermined what I formerly believed. What the heck is happening? It's like you and everyone you know always believed with every fiber of your being that 2 + 2 = 4. But Google's now telling you that 2 + 2 = 5? Now, Google hasn't gone that far, but I bring the 2 + 2 = 5 example up because that's the one that Orwell actually uses in the book. And you might ask why? Why would the party insist that people believe that 2 + 2 = 5? The party has no ideological reason to insist 2 + 2 = 5. It's really not a political or ideological thing. I mean, there's a sort of postmodern rejection of the truth enacted by the party, but it's not like when I hold up first 2 fingers and then I hold up another 2, it's not like they somehow believe that I'm actually holding up 5 fingers. They know I've only counted off 1, 2, 3, 4 discrete things. That's not the point. The reason they do it is because it represents the party's control over reality and truth. The reason it's significant is that it shows that by forcing citizens to accept obvious falsehoods, the party demonstrates its power to dictate what is real and to manipulate and suppress human thought and perception. The truth suddenly becomes whatever the party says is true. As the writer Angelo Codavia explains, the point of PC, and by the way, the term PC or political correctness actually originates in the Soviet Union. So Orwell might have actually been familiar with this term, but Codavia writes, the point of PC is not and has never been merely about any of the items it imposes, but about the imposition itself. And this is made clear in the book when O'Brien finally gets Winston to the Ministry of Love and basically explains to him the real secret reason behind the party's existence. O'Brien says basically where the communists and the Nazis both failed, and the big thing that they had in common was that they were utopians who sincerely believed that they were seizing power, and I'm going to quote O'Brien here, unwillingly and for a limited time. So the Nazis basically said, yes, we need to kill these people now. We need to fight these wars. We need to control you now. But eventually, we'll have this revival of the folk. We'll have this unity of spirit. We'll have this pure Aryan race, and there will be a brotherhood of man on earth. The Soviets said something very similar, but about class. They said, yes, we need to suspend free speech, strip you of your rights, purge all counter-revolutionaries, kill all class enemies. But guys, don't worry. There's a paradise where humans will be free and equal, and it's just around the corner. Don't worry. And once we've gotten rid of these heretics, once we've remade human beings into what the Bolsheviks called new Soviet man, once we've changed human nature, then there will be this gleaming utopian future. But this is where the party in 1984 is different. The party, O'Brien says, realizes that power is not a means to an end. It is the end itself. The end of persecution is persecution, O'Brien says. The power, in other words, for the party is the point. And then he says, quote, and this is just fantastic. He says, if you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stomping on a human face forever. And here's another way the party is different. And this gets to the whole point of thought control and the thought police and why the party sees itself as being able to succeed where other totalitarian societies of the past failed. And I think this is part of Orwell's central warning. The despotisms of the future will not see mind control as a means to an end. The mind control is the end. And this is a quote from O'Brien. He says, even in the instant of death, we cannot permit deviation. In the old days, the heretic walked to the stake still a heretic, proclaiming his heresy, exulting in it. Even the victim of the Russian purges could carry rebellion locked up in his skull as he walked the passage waiting for the bullet. But we make the brain perfect before we blow it out. The command of the old despotisms was thou shalt not. The command of the totalitarians was thou shalt. Our command is thou art. So that's it. If you want your one-party state to succeed and have full control forever, O'Brien says, it's not enough to just say thou shalt not. In other words, here's a list of things you can't do or say. It's not even enough to base your totalitarianism on thou shalt. In other words, here's a list of things you must do or say, and we will compel you to do or say them. No. What the party realizes is that the command must be thou art. You must be what we want you to be. You must really believe it. So pretty scary and creepy. Now that said, here's the good news. Even in Orwell's dystopian society, does anybody really in their deepest heart of hearts believe that 2 + 2 = 5 when it truly comes down to it? Like, there is such a thing as reality, and if I may be forced to be so blunt, reality doesn't really care whether you believe in it. It exists regardless of how you feel about it, right? If the party wants people to say that gravity doesn't exist, which actually is literally a reference to something O'Brien actually says in the book, it's like, okay, they can force you to speak that lie, to mouth that untruth. I mean, if you don't, the thought police will vaporize you. And by the way, that was Orwell's word for canceling someone, essentially, is to vaporize them, to make them disappear. Anyways, the party can make you say gravity isn't real. They can even get you in certain circumstances when it's necessary to believe it. But you're not going to jump out of, the 8th story window of your dingy Soviet-style flat based on that belief, because there's always a part of you that knows that reality is real, even if it's offensive to say so out loud. I mean, think about it. If your pharmacist genuinely believed that 2 + 2 = 5, you're not going to get the number of pills that you need to survive. If the engineers and construction workers applied that idea, the idea that 2 + 2 = 5, if they actually ran with that on the job, the bridges would fall over, right? Roadways would take you to the wrong places. Buildings would collapse while you're standing in them. And this is something Orwell touches on directly. In the past, Orwell writes, war was one of the main instruments by which human societies were kept in touch with physical reality. All rulers of all ages have tried to impose a false view of the world upon their followers, but they could not afford to encourage any illusion that tended to impair military efficiency, so long as defeat meant the loss of independence or some other result generally held to be undesirable. The precautions against defeat had to be serious. Physical facts could not be ignored. In philosophy or religion or ethics or politics, 2 and 2 might make 5, but when one was designing a gun or an airplane, they had to make 4. This, by the way, is what Orwell calls doublethink, which is a person's capacity to simultaneously accept 2 conflicting beliefs as being true, even if the conflicting belief is at odds with their own memory or even reality itself. And so you can easily think of many things in our post-truth age where you're expected to have one belief at work. Let's say you're a school teacher like me, and your workplace forces you to take this training at work that teaches you just something that is absolutely preposterous and that no reasonable person with any logical ability or scientific literacy would ever believe. And so you're sort of forced to nod along at the training or be fired. And then the moment that you leave the room, literally everyone that you were in that training with, people who at the time were all just nodding along with and participating in the farce, they all immediately revert back to normal and believe in the timeless truths of reality again. But when you're in the room, you can't even make a face that would indicate that you disagree with these ideas that are being presented, because that would be a face crime. And that's another term Orwell came up with when you're not sufficiently in agreement with the orthodoxy that's being pushed and your face betrays you. So guys, if I say anything that you disagree with, don't make a face, because Big Brother iWizard is always watching you. But anyways, all of this is why Orwell writes, and I think this is one of the most important passages in the book, that, quote, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 make 4. If that is granted, all else follows. So freedom is having the ability in a society to tell the truth. And so we've been talking about this theme of the truth and who dictates what's true, in the way in which many of our most powerful sense-making institutions sort of construct reality for us, and we let them, right? That's on us. So I did go off on a tangent there, but I wanted to get back to the language thing, because the purpose of this video is obviously to really think about our own world in terms of what Orwell predicted and how that is coming true. I mentioned Google earlier, but Webster's dictionary does this too. The new activist class, for example, will decide by fiat that it is politically convenient to change the definition of a word. So you'll have a word that reflects something bad in society. Let's say it's a bad thing, and sure, it's still a problem, and maybe we don't fully agree on how to fix it, but at least we as a society have a clear and perspicacious understanding of what that thing is. We may not agree on all the details, but if you did a poll, let's say in 2014, and surveyed people about the definition of this word, you would have broad and overwhelming agreement. No matter where you went, no matter what state you traveled to, people would agree about what that term generally means. And that's important because in order to have cogent debates about issues in society, you have to be able to define your terms. Well, now flash forward maybe 5 or 6 years, and maybe some scandalous event happens that sparks widespread protest. Maybe there's some policy being proposed, and the old definition doesn't cut it. You need a new definition that makes the term hazier and vaguer. The old definition doesn't cast a wide enough net. It doesn't apply to enough people. Well, what you do is you get your little interest group together, and this has happened plenty of times. You pressure these institutions to memory hole the old definition and swap it out with your new politically motivated one. And once you do that, once Merriam-Webster or Google Dictionary or Collins Dictionary, once you can get them to change the word, now teachers and professors and journalists across the nation not only have permission to run with this definition as the authoritative one, but in many cases they have to, they're required to. And then suddenly you realize that controlling words and dictating what they mean in a top-down fashion is extremely Orwellian. And I say in a top-down fashion because, as we all know, language evolves, language changes, but that process usually happens in an organic fashion from the bottom up. That's how language change is supposed to work. But one of the reasons I bring this up is because this can also lead to what social scientists call euphemism treadmills. A euphemism treadmill, if you haven't heard of this, is when you have a word that signifies a thing that people generally considered to be negative or unfortunate, say a mental disability or something like that. Well, there's a now offensive term, which didn't used to be seen as offensive, the R word, which used to be used by doctors and by everyone really, in which literally means slow. I mean, that's a synonym for the word. But still, eventually the R word came to be used as an insult, obviously. And so then we started using the word slow instead. Again, we were just switched to its synonym. But then because you can't just change people's attitudes about the underlying phenomenon by changing the word, people started using slow as an insult in the same way that the R word was sometimes used as an insult. So when slow became offensive, we swapped that out for the euphemism mentally challenged. Then when the term mentally challenged became offensive, we replaced that with the even more egregious euphemism special. And that's when we changed the names of these school programs to special education or the special bus or what have you. But then that became offensive. And so I kid you not, we replaced the term special with, quote, neurodivergent, which is a euphemism so bad that it doesn't even describe the phenomenon you're trying to communicate in any way. It's really a vague, meaningless phrase. Like seriously, divergent from what? Neurodivergent from what? My wife, for example, is brilliant. She's much smarter than me. She's mathy. When she was in college, she got A's in very difficult math and physics courses that I could never pass. I'm not necessarily the greatest at math, so technically she's neurodivergent from me, and I'm neurodivergent from her, and we're all technically neurodivergent from one another. It's a signifier that has no concrete signification. The term doesn't point to anything specific. And so now we've gotten to the point, you're not even going to believe this, the euphemisms have gotten so bad that by 2014, and this was when I was finishing graduate school for my degree in teaching, they had changed the preferred word again, but this time to a word that literally means the opposite of what you're actually trying to say. Ladies and gentlemen, I had to take a course in graduate school called, and again, I'm not kidding here, The Exceptional Child in the Classroom. The Exceptional Child. And when I signed up for this class, I legitimately thought I was taking a course on teaching advanced students, building a curriculum that challenges advanced, precocious, exceptional learners. But I was very wrong. The course was all about special education, and we were told to use the word exceptional when speaking about kids with severe learning disabilities. Now, exceptional might mean like an exception to the rule, but that's not how we use the word. That's not the connotation of it. And so that's a euphemism treadmill. Here's another one. I know we could just do this all day, so this will be the last one I do. In describing people who have physical ailments, we went from We went from lame to crippled to handicapped to disabled. I know I'm skipping some steps, but we got to the point where we're at now. You ready for this? People are now legitimately using the word differently abled. Again, a word that is not descriptive whatsoever. I mean, LeBron James is technically differently abled from me. He can dunk a basketball. I cannot dunk a basketball. Everyone is differently abled from everyone else. And here's where it goes fully off the rails. And I have no idea if this is true or not. But a friend recently told me that people are now demanding that the word handicapped be swapped out for handy-capable. Handy-capable, which again means the opposite of handicapped. And this isn't just a rant, guys. This kind of thing is literally the point of 1984. Orwell writes all about this in his famous essay, Politics and the English Language, which I believe came out just before 1984 was written. In that essay, Orwell talks about how political language in our times, and I'm going to quote him, is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. And I know that in the cases I mentioned, look, I know that the intention is almost always good. I understand that. With something like the R word, this constant changing of the words is designed to make the language people use less hurtful. And again, I understand that. And no good person at any rate, really wants to hurt anyone's feelings. So we let things go. We put up with these euphemisms, with these non-descriptive terms and abuses of language, because we're trying ultimately to not hurt people's feelings, to lift them up, and to bring about a kinder, gentler world. But there's also a really dangerous and insidious element of this tendency that I think Orwell wanted us to be constantly on guard about. And I'll give you another example from his essay, Politics and the English Language. Orwell writes, quote, "In our time, political speech and writing are largely the defense of the indefensible. Things like the continuance of British rule in India, the Russian purges and deportations, the dropping of the atom bombs on Japan can indeed be defended, but only by arguments which are too brutal for most people to face and which do not square with the professed aims of the political parties. Thus, political language has to consist largely of euphemism, question-begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness. Defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine gunned, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets. This is called pacification. Millions of peasants are robbed of their farms and sent trudging along the roads with no more than they can carry. This is called transfer of population or rectification of frontiers. People are imprisoned for years without trial or shot in the back of the neck or sent to die of scurvy in Arctic lumber camps. This is called elimination of unreliable elements. Such phraseology is needed if one wants to name things without calling up mental pictures of them." All right, so you get the picture, right? Orwell is worried about the fact that Stalin is over here saying that he's going to, quote, liquidate the kulaks as a class, which, let's be clear, meant rounding up Russia's competent landowning peasant farmers, collectivizing their farms and murdering many of them, and then sending the rest to gulags in Siberia where they were starved, worked to death, or frozen to death, all of which led to a gigantic, massive famine, which killed millions of Russians. And so Stalin uses a euphemism. He says he's going to liquidate their class, essentially. And the Western press, Pulitzer Prize winning correspondents like, at the time, Walter Duranty, they just ran with it. And the Western world, unable to look into this matter themselves, they just think, oh, well, that Stalin fella sure is intense, but, he just wants a classless society, right? He wants the world to be more equal. And speaking of Stalin, this is really what Winston does at the Ministry of Truth. Stalin was famous for his willingness to alter and edit reality. He had a department of agitation and propaganda. He would often use a large group of image retouchers to cut his enemies out of documentary photographs. And probably his most famous erasure was that of Nikola Yetsov. So this guy Yetsov was a secret police official who oversaw the purges and was basically Stalin's right-hand man. And his job was essentially to interrogate, falsely accuse, and order executions for thousands of party officials. But eventually, the other shoe dropped, as it always did in Soviet Russia. And in 1938, Yezhov fell from Stalin's favor, obviously. Then he was arrested and then tortured and executed, but not before giving a forced confession so that Stalin could blame all of the purges on him. And you can see here that Stalin's censors actually removed Yezhov from all the photographic records. And this is what Orwell meant by vaporize. You can see him smiling next to Stalin there. And then poof, he's gone. So how's that for some early 20th century Photoshop there? Pretty creepy. But again, this stuff has only become more relevant to us today as technology has improved. It's never been easier to use editing software and filters. We have AI and deepfakes and alterations of all kind. You have our own government pressuring social media companies to censor information that they find politically unfavorable. Yeah, just to get back to the point, I think part of Orwell's message is really the importance of having a free press that will challenge power without fear or favor, and that upholds truth and our ability to speak the truth regardless of party affiliation as its highest and noble calling. That's what the press should exist to do. And I think a lot of that starts with teachers and parents and the instruction of critical thinking. Who controls the past, ran the party slogan. And this is a quote from early on in the book. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And when I read that line to my students, they often say, whoa, that sounds really familiar, Mr. Hill. Have I heard that before? And yeah, that's because Rage Against the Machine uses that line in one of their songs. And so suddenly when I read that line to them, the kids sit up a little bit straighter because kids still listen to Rage Against the Machine. And speaking of kids, one of the simultaneously horrific and scary, but also undeniably real aspects of this book is the role that children play for the party. So in Oceania, the children are trained from an early age to be like party zealots and guardians of the state who are unflinchingly loyal to Ingsoc, even over and above their own families. So the kids are part of this organization called the Spies. And what they do is they run around in these little outfits essentially enforcing the party orthodoxy, learning jingoistic slogans, accusing people of being traitors, snitching on adults and accusing them essentially of wrongthink, and in many cases ratting on their own parents and turning them into the thought police. Here is Winston talking about his neighbor, Mrs. Parsons. He says, quote, "With those children, another year, 2 years, and they would be watching her night and day for symptoms of unorthodoxy. Nearly all children nowadays were horrible. What was the worst of all was that by means of organizations such as the Spies, they were systematically turned into ungovernable little savages. And yet, this produced in them no tendency whatever to rebel against the discipline of the party. On the contrary, they adored the party and everything connected with it. The songs, the processions, the banners, the hiking, the yelling of slogans, the worship of Big Brother. It was all a sort of glorious game to them. All their ferocity was turned outwards against the enemies of the state, against foreigners, traitors, saboteurs, thought criminals. It was almost normal for people over 30 to be frightened of their own children. And with good reason. Hardly a week passed in which the Times didn't carry a paragraph describing how some eavesdropping little sneak, child hero was the phrase generally used, had overheard some compromising remark and reported their parents to the thought police. And so again, if you haven't studied history, you might think Orwell's being overwrought here, but it's real. Go back to Nazi Germany and you have the Hitler Youth. In 1939, more than 82% of eligible youth ages 10 to 18 belonged to Hitler Youth, or there was a female equivalent that was called the League of German Girls. And this was all a part of Nazifying German society. They call this Gleichschaltung. And the whole aim of this process was to dismantle existing social structures and traditions. It was all about imposing conformity. Kids wore the same uniforms. They sang the same Nazi songs. And in fact, they were even encouraged in many cases to report to their leaders about what was happening in their schools, in their churches, in their homes. You had similar groups in the Soviet Union. I believe they were called the Young Pioneers. In fact, the most famous story about this is that of Pavel Morozov. So basically, the Soviet regime and their state media publicized this story in 1932 of this 13-year-old boy who is said to have ratted out and denounced his father and was in turn apparently killed by his family. And so this boy was praised by the Soviet press as a martyr and a hero. And so this took off, and the whole thing turned into this legend with songs and plays and a full-length opera about this kid and 6 biographies. He was even put on a Soviet postage stamp. And so basically, through all this propaganda, this mythologized story was used to encourage Soviet bloc children to inform on their parents. It turns out, though, that the whole thing was fabricated. The kid himself was real, Pavel Morozov, but he was likely killed by a GPU agent. But it's just another example of how children have always been used as pawns by totalitarian regimes. And in Russia, it wasn't just children. In the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, Dr. Robert Pringle reports that at the height of the Soviet Union, 1 out of every 18 adults were informants for Stalin's regime that we know of. So imagine being in a classroom, like a college classroom of, say, 36 students, and knowing that statistically, at least 2 of your classmates were likely state informants. So just a horrifying prospect. Of course, in communist China during the Cultural Revolution, you literally had Mao mobilizing his Red Guard. These were groups of young people from elementary school children to university students, and their job was to enforce communist dogma and to rid China of the so-called 4 olds. That would be old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. So they'd run around in their little uniforms destroying Buddhist temples and antiques and relics of the past. They would tear up and burn old books. They'd publicly humiliate their teachers, monks, former landowners, anyone suspected of being against the communist regime, of being a counter-revolutionary. They'd take over universities and shame the professors. They would get them fired, or sometimes they would just publicly mob and humiliate them, and in many cases, murder them. Professors would have to stand up or be paraded through the streets with placards around their necks. You can see the dunce caps they'd have to wear. The Red Guard, my gosh, they were terrifying. They almost even destroyed an entire animal population, like Pekingese dogs, because they were associated with the old imperial regime, and they very nearly went extinct because of them. In all, thousands of people were killed outright as these kids grew increasingly violent. And if you want to see a good representation of this in recent television, you should watch the 3-Body Problem on, I think it's either Netflix or Apple, but that whole show opens with literally this happening. A daughter literally undermining and betraying her father and publicly shaming and humiliating him and then killing him for not agreeing with the current party orthodoxy. And you can see glimpses of the return of this attitude even today. The fact that parents are afraid of their own children increasingly. The fact that parents are afraid to discipline their own children. We have gentle parenting. The fact that teachers and professors are, in many cases, afraid of their own students. The inmates, in many cases, are running the asylum. We've seen numerous cases in recent years of professors and teachers being fired for saying things that, were considered to be completely innocuous and totally uncontroversial just a decade or 2 ago. There have been cases where teachers have been fired for refusing to use certain words that students want them to use. Students screaming at professors and filming it, using social media to mob their professors online and then basically chasing them out of their jobs. You have campuses very recently being entirely taken over by petulant teenagers who are possessed by this very out of touch ideology that the vast majority of people find mind-boggling and silly and unworkable. The social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor at NYU and who's written many books and is like one of the most mainstream accepted social scientists out there, he says this is just untenable and out of control. Here is a clip of Haidt talking about it.
It really was a glitch in the matrix, and it started when a student at NYU reported me for showing a video that I'd shown 50 times before, a research video. It was just a video about an experiment. And she objected to one word in it and said she felt unsafe and reported me, and the system, nobody could stand up and say, wait, this is, it had to be investigated. And so that was the thing, like, wait, what just happened? This is the worst thing in my academic life. Like, what the hell happened? And then I started seeing all around, like this was happening everywhere. So it hit me in, as I said, January 2015 is when it first hit me, and then I started seeing it. And then in May 2015 is when Greg Lukianoff came to me. So really that semester that everything changed. Because in every bathroom, there's the sign telling students 3 ways to report me if I say something that offends them, literally. And on every, I told my ID card, on the back of my NYU ID, it has campus police, mental health, bias response line. So if I say anything that anyone can interpret as a microaggression, here's how you report the professor.
Anyway, so what was the point of all of this? Why have we seen this happening? Well, kids are unbelievably impressionable. So if you want ideological and cultural hegemony, the best place to start is often with the kids. Kids are naturally open-minded. Their brains are not fully formed yet. They don't know anything about the world or how it works. And so they're incredibly malleable. And of course, the idea behind an ideology like communism, and Orwell knew this even though he was like a democratic socialist, is that human beings are malleable. It's the idea that we can become what Marx termed species being, which was like a prototype for what the Bolsheviks called new Soviet man. Species being, the idea that we can overcome our natural selfishness. We can overcome our private loyalties, which give us so much meaning. We can rid ourselves of these things that we say are ours, and instead we can become this being who lives for our species alone, that we can become these beings who see no distinction between one person and another, that we can live for our fellow man, our comrades, our brothers in the abstract, right? So communism is premised on the idea that human beings can overcome these very important natural bonds that tie us to religion, to home, to country, even to our own history. And the reason for this is that these pre-political institutions are very dangerous to totalitarian regimes, because that is a bond that is over and above the state. It's a loyalty that transcends the state. And as long as that's there, those institutions are going to be a threat to the state. It's why the fascist dictator Mussolini famously demanded, quote, everything inside of the state, nothing outside of the state. The idea that you might owe your highest loyalty to God rather than the state, the idea that you would sacrifice your life for your child or for your spouse, but that you definitely would not do that for the state. The idea that you find meaning in these little platoons, as Edmund Burke called them. I mean, and it's history too. In 1984, one of the big things is that history is being erased, and that it has to be erased because otherwise people might be able to look back into the past and say, wait a minute, actually things used to be better. You haven't made things better. This economic plan that you're foisting on the population, I'm reading history, and that's been tried before, and it fails every time. And you can see this too in what is probably the most, by far, the most popular passage in the book. And that is when Winston says to Julia, quote, "Do you realize that the past, starting from yesterday, has actually been abolished? If it survives anywhere, it's in a few solid objects with no words attached to them. Already we know almost literally nothing about the revolution and the years before the revolution. Every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered, and the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right." And so if you think about the fact that history scores and knowledge of history by all available data is going down in the US. If you think about the way in 2024 that we've outsourced our minds, we feel that we no longer need to remember facts. We'll just look it up on Google. I no longer need to have a lay of the land. I no longer need to have any kind of sense of direction. I can just use GPS. I no longer need to know how to cook my own food. I'll just order DoorDash or Grubhub every night. I no longer need to use my legs. I can just ride around in this electric wheelchair like the people in WALL-E. We feel that we no longer need to read dusty old books and to question them and really grapple with those books, which in most cases were written by people who actually lived through those important historical periods that we're reading about. No, I'll just look it up on Wikipedia. Anything I want to know about, say, the Vietnam War, yeah, I'll just look that up I'll just Google it. I'll just find it on Wikipedia. And again, Wikipedia is a human institution. It's not infallible. As wonderful as it is, and my wife donates money to them every year, given how much she and I both use Wikipedia, as scholars we have to. As wonderful as it is, it's still biased. It's subject to immense political and lobby pressure, and in some cases, ideological capture. In fact, Larry Sanger, who is literally one of the two co-founders of Wikipedia, he has since completely disassociated himself from Wikipedia. He recently spoke out about how he believes Wikipedia has become the mouthpiece of a, quote, reliably establishment point of view on socio-political issues, as opposed to the collaborative encyclopedia that he had originally envisioned it to be. He says that a, quote, complex game is being played to make the article say what somebody wants them to say. And he goes on to say that the site is badly biased and, quote, no longer has an effective neutrality policy. And he ends by saying that, quote, the word for it is propaganda. And there have been numerous studies to this effect showing how biased Wikipedia is. And so I'll finish up here. We'll end here on this. I don't want the video to go too long. One of the main lessons that Orwell communicates is the idea that we need to be fighting for freedom constantly because it's always one generation away from dying. And we've seen what it looks like when freedom dies. Here's some Orwellian footage from China in recent years. This is a drone flying over the city of Shanghai, broadcasting the message, and this is during COVID, control your soul's desire for freedom. Do not open the window or sing.
到底维持到啥个辰光？我总要把个标准，或者是讲有一个具体的说法。没，侬讲看，闷了7天，到了屋里向不能出。
九族家园的居民朋友们，在疫情封控期间，请严格遵守市政府相关防疫规定，控制灵魂对自由的渴望，不要开窗歌唱，此行为有疫情传播的。
In 1984, the citizens are constantly being watched by these ubiquitous devices called telescreens. Everyone's got one at their desk, at work. Everyone's got one at home. And the telescreen's job is to not only to broadcast important messages to you that the state wants you to see, but it's also to listen to everything that you say and watch everything that you do, or at least instill the fear in you that it may be watching. And the goal of the surveillance in the Soviet Union, likewise, was not to like spy on everything everyone said or keep track of people, because they didn't actually have the full ability to process all of the material that they were taking in. The purpose of doing this was that everyone suspected that they might be being watched at all times, which inherently is going to change the way that everyone behaves. When you feel like you're on guard and paranoid at all times, you start to shy away from exercising freedoms that you actually may, in some cases, have. And this is called self-censorship. So people not necessarily being banned, but there being a powerful social censorship and a sense of real fear of telling the truth. And here's a quote from Winston. "There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment," admits Winston. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. And so think about our own lives and the way that we're now living and operating in the West. Even though the Patriot Act, for example, expired in 2020, one thing that we've learned is that we're still effectively living under it. We're still being watched and listened to by the feds. And by the way, guys, this isn't just some tinfoil hat stuff. I'm basically allergic to conspiracy theories. It's just literally a fact that federal law enforcement agencies have been able to retain most of the authorities granted to them by the Patriot Act. Speaking of the telescreen from 1984, even our devices, our computers, our cell phones, these are constantly listening to us, collecting data to sell us ads, tracking us. And so the way I see Orwell's book is that it's a warning. 1984 doesn't really end well. Spoiler alert, it's a bleak ending. And Orwell's purpose in doing this was to warn us, to remind us of how truly bad things can get before it's too late. So what can we do? Well, we need to remember that in a country like ours, we were meant to fight for our freedom, to self-govern, to hold our representatives accountable, to be constantly vigilant. The power in this country needs to be separated and checked. The government needs to be limited. That is uncontroversial. And power is supposed to be vested in we, the people. They work for us, not the other way around. Also, it's not just about our government. In many dystopian novels, including 1984, including Fahrenheit 451, one of the ways that tyranny gets ushered in is that people begin to forget what freedom is. People begin to grow tired of the constant vigilance, of the tolerance and the institutions that freedom requires. Free speech, the defense of our core natural rights, the basic right to protect ourselves, accountable institutions, federalism, subsidiarity, a press that looks out for the interests of working people, not powerful politicians and special interests. I could go on all day, but those are the things that we need, and it's up to us. Anyways, I'm going to cut us off here and sign out. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for watching. Catch up with us on Goodreads, Facebook, Instagram, and please feel free to tip your starving booktuber over at Patreon. And until next time, guys, happy reading.